are natural storytellers and that literature is not something to be locked away in libraries, and I fully agree with that. The examples of the major types of genres of literature to be explored here are the poem, the novel, and the short story. Some of these works are classics, meaning that they are still relevant beyond their time. Some of the works to be discussed have earned the right to be called masterpieces, meaning that they exceed what other writers were doing at the same time. The basic literary impulse is people's need to leave behind a record of themselves. The epic, a genre that emerged in early societies, is a long narrative poem recounting the adventures of a hero who is courageous, strong, and smart, but not necessarily moral. Gilgamesh is one of the earliest epics. Discovered during the 7th century BCE, it tells the story of a king in the city of Uruk, in what is now modern-day Iraq, who lived around 2700 BCE. Gilgamesh was so formidable that the gods, intimidated by him, created Enkidu, his kinder, gentler alter ego. The epic builds to a spectacular wrestling match between the Superman, Gilgamesh, and his alter ego, Enkidu, that ends in a tie, suggesting, for us, the view that humanity needs both aggression and compassion in order to survive. An early acknowledged masterpiece of Western literature is Homer's Iliad, variously dated between 1200 and 800 BCE. One theory is that the work was composed over several centuries and therefore cannot have been the work of a single author. It's possible that a poet named Homer was the last known writer, and that's one theory. If the purpose of the epics was to provide a given culture with a history and a heritage, what sets the Iliad apart is that it treats the supposed enemy, that is the city of Troy, sympathetically, even to the point of making Hector both a central and tragic hero. But this may be reading too much into the intent of the author. Achilles, the Greek hero, is brave and brilliant in his military exploits, as an epic hero was supposed to be, and Hector exhibits the tragic flaw of pride. Perhaps it could be said that the Iliad has the Greek tragic perspective. It must be noted that the story of the Trojan horse does not appear in the Iliad. Many centuries later, Virgil would immortalize it in the the Aeneid, a consciously nationalistic epic by a poet who was expected to glorify Rome, which traced its lineage back to Troy and would therefore have considered the Greek victory as one of dishonorable cunning. Also of interest is the fact that the author of the Iliad does not separate the two main characters into good and bad, protagonist and antagonist, which is a highly sophisticated approach, indicating the Greek literary genius, which would flower a few centuries later. Along with the epics, the Greeks and Romans develop a sophisticated tradition of lyrical poetry, which its name derives from the lyre, the instrument used to accompany the sung poem. Sappho among the Greeks, Catullus among the Romans were two of the best-known lyric poets. Love, especially lost or unrequited, was a favorite theme, as it would be for the Elizabethans many centuries later. The 14-line sonnet, with its rigid requirements of meter and rhyme, was developed in the 14th century by the Italian Petrarch, and then later perfected by the English Shakespeare. The iambic pentameter rule can make a poem sound at times monotonous and sing-songy, Unless the poet can, like Shakespeare, keep the lines flowing into each other and the rhymes from calling undue attention to themselves. In Shakespeare's great sonnets, the meter doesn't get in the way of the words, so that it, as well as the rhymes, seems to be accidentally there. As you know, a metaphor is an abstract idea, such as love, explained in terms of something that is visual and concrete, such as a rose. A famous metaphor from Shakespeare is Romeo's statement that Juliet is the sun. The poet John Donne is famous for a specific kind of metaphor called a conceit, or an elaborate and extended association between two dissimilar things. For example, in one celebrated sonnet, he develops a daring conceit that equates the wish to surrender oneself to God, letting go of one's involvement with evil, as a desire to be kidnapped and ravished in spite of oneself by a dashing lover. Edna St. Vincent Millay's sonnet adheres to iambic pentameter and a strict rhyme scheme. Like Shakespeare before her, she manages to conceal their presence while giving prominence to her meaning. Many of her sonnets are about lost love. The Japanese haiku, a short poetic form based on oneness with the natural world, is another strict form, 17 syllables distributed with 5, 7, 5 over 3 lines. The form challenges the poet to capture image and idea swiftly and to convey an intuitive insight. William Blake carved out a unique achievement in the history of poetry, using the nursery rhyme form and childlike verse to pose powerful questions about our loss of innocence and the inevitable confrontation with life's dark side as we gain experience. The innocent child's viewpoint of the lamb becomes the troubled, mature viewpoint of the tiger. The questions Blake raises are eternal ones about the nature of good and evil, yet their unexpected poetic form makes them fresh, disturbing, and powerful. Religious poetry satisfies the age-old desire to praise and communicate with the divine. Jared Manley Hopkins dedicated himself to poetry that reaffirmed God's glory and at the same time paved the way for modernism. His unified poetic language contains what he called sprung rhythm, or a sudden interruption that makes us trip over the words, slow down, and thus see their meanings with new eyes. Such an interruption is presented in the last line of his poem, God's Grandeur, when the poet, after presenting his image of the Holy Ghost hovering protectively over the world, exclaims with, "Ah, bright wings." Emily Dickinson, like Blake, combined apparent simplicity of language with profound and complex thoughts and feelings. Dickinson can be seen as a transition poet, at times lyrical and at other times abandoning traditional patterns. One of the major poets to emerge from the Harlem Renaissance in 1924 was Georgia Douglas Johnson, whose poem Black Woman is quoted in full in your text. Aspects of the poem that show that it belongs to the modern era include the subject of abortion itself and the structure which builds to a sudden, startling revelation of the subject. John Ciardi's contention that modern readers have lost the joy of reading poetry aloud is a good transition to a discussion of more recent trends in poetry. According to Ciardi, poetry has become a largely silent language. This means that poems of today need not be understood immediately but can be read, reread, and pondered over. A good example of this is found in the poetry of Billy Collins, whose poem My Number illustrates deceptive simplicity in its use of common, everyday speech as a way of inviting the reader in and then revealing its larger and darker subject. By the way, Billy Collins is a world-famous poet who was on our campus last year and gave a poetry reading. All right, the next transition then takes us to comments on the novel and the short story, and that's more or less the second half of our discussion of literature, and we'll be talking about that in class. So, thanks for listening, and look forward to discussing these concepts with you in class.